Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to step through a door into the past, into the sprawling, magnificent, and often brutal world of the Ottoman Empire. This is a land of legends, a place of powerful sultans, mysterious harems, and legendary Janissary soldiers. A place where the coffee was brewed so strong and dark, it was said it could jolt the dead back to life. So, before we begin this journey, and you get settled in, if you enjoy the stories we tell here, please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd also love to hear where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always incredible to see our community stretching across the globe. Now, find a comfortable spot, maybe dim the lights down low, and let's ease into tonight's story together. For more than 600 years, the Ottoman Empire was an absolute powerhouse of a civilization, a titan that stood at the crossroads of three continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. Think about that for a moment. Its vast influence stretched all the way from the fortified gates of Vienna in the heart of Europe down to the sun-scorched shores of the Arabian Peninsula. When you hear the words Ottoman Empire, your mind probably conjures up some very specific, very grand images. You might picture the breathtaking skyline of Istanbul, a city pierced by the slender, elegant minarets of its countless mosques, their golden domes gleaming under the sun. Maybe you imagine the glittering, almost unbelievable treasures held within the secretive walls of Topkapı Palace, rooms overflowing with jewels, silks, and centuries of secrets. Or perhaps you can almost smell the air of the Grand Bazaar, a chaotic, wonderful labyrinth of covered streets, thick with the scent of exotic spices, roasting meats, and sweet perfumes, echoing with the shouts of merchants and the haggling of 1,000 different languages. It's an image that has been carefully crafted over centuries, one of almost unimaginable opulence, of absolute power, and of a deep, exotic mystery that continues to fascinate us to this day. And all of that, it's true. That empire of glittering palaces and powerful sultans did exist. But here's the thing we have to remember, that's the highlight reel. That's the version of the story you get in the travel brochure, the polished, curated experience designed to awe and inspire. For the vast, overwhelming majority of the people who actually lived under Ottoman rule, and we are talking about a staggering 90% of the population, if not more, life had absolutely nothing to do with silk pillows, jewel-encrusted daggers, or debates about poetry in palace gardens. Their reality wasn't a grand adventure. It was a daily, grinding struggle. Their world was one made of mud, not marble. Their calendars were marked by tax collection dates, not royal festivals. And their primary ambition for any given day wasn't to gain power or influence, but simply to try not to die before lunch. It was a life of subsistence, a life of labor, a life lived on the very edge of survival, where one bad harvest or one new tax could spell disaster for an entire family. So tonight, we're not just going to visit the Ottoman Empire as tourists, looking at the pretty buildings. We're going to do something a little different. We're going to time travel. And here is the most important part of our journey. The one rule we have to follow: we have to be realistic. We have to obey the laws of statistics. And that means we're not going to magically land in the Sultan's court, draped in silks and tasting exotic foods. That's a 1 in a million shot. No, if we were to be dropped into this world, the odds are almost certain where we'd end up. Statistically, you and I, we're landing in the dirt. We're not going to be the ones making the history that gets written down in the grand chronicles. We're going to be the ones whose lives are lived in the footnotes, the silent majority whose sweat and toil fueled the entire magnificent machine. So, let's take a deep breath and leave the brochure version of history behind. Our story begins not in the palace, but in the field. It begins with the harsh light of a new day. A day like any other, which means it's already a struggle. You open your eyes, and for a fleeting second, you're caught in the hazy space between a dream and the waking world. But that moment of peace is shattered almost instantly, replaced by a wave of familiar disappointment. There are no high marble halls here, no golden domes catching the morning light, and certainly no soft silk curtains whispering in the breeze. Instead, the first thing you feel is the rough, scratchy texture of a straw mat beneath you, a mat that's thin, lumpy, and does little to cushion you from the cold, hard earth below. The air you breathe in is damp and heavy, thick with the smell of wet wool, stale smoke, and the unmistakable, pungent aroma of goat. If you're a peasant, and as we've established, the statistics are not in your favour, this is your palace. Your grand estate consists of 4 mud brick walls, a low ceiling stained black with years of soot, and the constant, shuffling presence of livestock who act like they own the place. And when we say mud walls, don't picture some charming rustic cottage. We're not being poetic here. We are talking about a structure made from the most basic materials imaginable: wattle and daub. Imagine a simple frame, a lattice of thin wooden strips or reeds, and then picture that frame being packed by hand with a thick, sticky mixture of wet soil, clay, sand, animal dung, and chopped straw. This mixture dries in the sun, hardening into a wall that keeps out most of the wind, but not all of it. Never all of it. Drafts are a constant companion. The floor isn't made of wood or stone, it's just the earth itself, packed down hard by the feet of your family and your animals over years. Maybe, if you've had a good season, you've been able to scatter some rushes or dried reeds on the ground for a little bit of warmth and to keep the dampness at bay, but they quickly get trodden into the dirt. Looking up, you see the roof is just as simple, a thatch of straw or reeds, which is great until it rains, and then it's a constant battle against drips and leaks. In the very centre of this single, cramped room is the source of all your comfort and a great deal of your misery, the fire pit. This small, shallow hole in the ground is your only source of heat for the cold nights, and your only way to cook whatever meagre food you have. But you'll notice something is missing. There is no chimney. The smoke from the constantly smouldering fire has nowhere to go, except for a small, hopeful hole in the middle of the thatched roof. The result is predictable. The air inside your home is perpetually thick and hazy with smoke, a grey fog that never fully clears. It stings your eyes, making them water constantly, and it catches in the back of your throat, leaving you with a permanent, rasping cough. Over time, this smoke coats every single surface, every wall, every blanket, every pot, and even your own skin in a thin, greasy layer of soot. You live, eat, and sleep in a cloud of your own making. You try to sit up, your body aching from the hard ground, and your eyes finally focus on a movement in the corner. The family goat is placidly chewing on the sleeve of your only shirt. You let out a sigh, but there's no real anger in it. This isn't some quirky, inconvenient roommate situation. This is just life. In this world, humans and their most valuable animals, their goats, their sheep, maybe even a calf or a prized cow, all huddle together in the same small, enclosed space. There are very practical reasons for this. Sharing the room keeps everyone, human and animal, warmer during the freezing nights. More importantly, it protects your precious livestock from being stolen by thieves or carried off by wolves, threats that are all too real. But the practicalities don't make the reality any less grim. There is no privacy, no clean space, just the constant sounds, smells, and presence of animals day and night. This is your life. This is your reality in the Ottoman Empire. You are a member of the Ria. That's the official, bureaucratic term for people like you, the tax-paying lower class, the simple subjects of the great Sultan. But you should know what that word you're called actually means, what the men in the fancy robes in Istanbul think of when they say it. In Turkish, Ria translates literally and directly to flock or herd. And let's be very clear, that was not intended as a compliment. It perfectly and chillingly captures how the entire ruling class, the Sultan, his viziers, his generals, and all their officials, viewed you and everyone you know. You are livestock. You are a resource to be managed, a number in a ledger. You are to be protected from wolves. Yes, but only just enough to ensure that the flock survives to be sheared again next season. The state wasn't necessarily interested in making you miserable just for the fun of it. That would be a waste of energy. Your misery was simply an irrelevant and uninteresting byproduct of a very cold, very pragmatic system. The entire stability of this vast, glorious empire depended on two things: the grain that came from your fields and the taxes that came from your pocket. Your personal happiness, your comfort, your dreams, those things ranked somewhere far, far below the task of sharpening spears for the army. This wasn't a system of chaotic, mustache-twirling evil. It was in many ways something much worse. It was a system of cold, calculated, and absolute indifference, where you were a resource to be cultivated and harvested, no different from the barley growing in your field. You stumbled out of your smoke-filled hut, your stomach twisting into a tight, aching knot. The growl it makes is low and hollow, a sound you know all too well. It's the sound of the morning. You're ready for breakfast, but ready is a strong word. You're more like braced for it. In this world, breakfast isn't a cheerful start to the day. Forget about the simple pleasures of eggs, or a slice of salty cheese, or anything even remotely warm and comforting. In the Ottoman Empire, at least for you, breakfast isn't a meal, it's an ordeal. It's the first test of a long day, a physical and mental challenge designed to see if you still have the will to live. You look at what's waiting for you, and a familiar sense of resignation washes over you. Congratulations, you get bread, but you need to erase any image you have of bread right now. This isn't the soft, fluffy white bread you might be thinking of. That kind of bread is a luxury, made from fine wheat, and wheat is a cash crop. Something you grow to give away to your landlord, or to sell at the market if you're lucky. Your bread, the bread of the riaya, is a different beast entirely. It's made from the coarser, cheaper grains, the stuff that's left over barley, maybe some rye. The loaf itself is a dark, dense, and incredibly heavy thing. It feels more like a rock than a foodstuff. It's so hard, in fact, that it could genuinely double as a weapon if you were desperate enough to throw it at someone. Each morning, you take this loaf and saw off a piece, an act that requires a surprising amount of effort. The crust is thick and tough, and the inside is dense and chewy, with a gritty texture from the coarsely ground grains. The taste is, well, it's mostly just bland, with a faint, slightly sour aftertaste. This is your breakfast. It's your jaw, and the monumental challenge of not breaking your teeth before the sun is even fully in the sky. To make the whole process slightly less agonizing, you have a couple of options. You might dip the hard chunk of bread into a bowl of water, letting it soak for a minute until it softens into a gritty, porridge-like mush that you can swallow without a fight. If you're having a particularly good week, and I mean a really, really good week, you might have a small clay pot of olive oil. Dipping your bread into that feels like the height of luxury, the oil adding a bit of flavor and precious calories. But don't count on it. That's a treat, not a daily routine. On most mornings, it's just the bread and water. If you're lucky, you might add a second option, a pot of something called pottage. This was the other great staple of peasant life, a kind of perpetual stew that was always simmering away over the fire pit in the center of your hut. It was a thick, soupy, gloopy mixture of boiled grains, beans, and whatever humble vegetables you could grow in a small garden plot next to your home, which usually meant onions, leeks, and a whole lot of cabbage. It was filling, sure. It was warm. But imagine eating the exact same bland, mushy, greyish stew day after day, week after week, with no change in flavour or texture. It's food as fuel, nothing more. The real torture comes if you ever have to go into a city. Maybe you're there to sell a few major items or to pay a tax. As you walk through the crowded streets, your senses are assaulted in the most wonderful and terrible way. You catch the warm, incredible smell of real bread, of flatbreads baking in hot clay ovens, their surfaces golden and puffed up, maybe sprinkled with toasted sesame seeds. You see vendors selling handfuls of glistening olives from a barrel of brine, or thick, white chunks of salty cheese. The smell alone is enough to make your empty stomach ache, with a hunger so sharp it feels like a physical blow. But unless you have a few precious coins jingling in your purse, you have to keep walking, to keep dreaming. The food markets of a great city like Istanbul were a true paradise for the wealthy, a place of unbelievable abundance. But for everyone else, they were a special kind of torture chamber. You'd smell the rich, fatty aroma of roasting lamb turning on a spit. You'd see trays of sweet, honey-soaked pastries, piles of fresh figs, and beautifully stuffed vegetables, all staples of real Turkish cuisine, and all a universe away from your reality. So you turn away from the smells of the city and come back to your own world, to the piece of hard barley bread in your hand. You wolf it down quickly, not because it's delicious, but because the emptiness in your stomach is a more pressing concern than the strain on your jaw. You tell yourself it's fine. It's rustic. You might think, trying to put a romantic spin on your grim reality. You pretend your stomach isn't already planning its quiet, gurgling rebellion against the dense, heavy mass you've just forced into it. By the time you've swallowed the last crumb, you don't feel satisfied. You don't feel energized. You just feel alive. And in the harsh, unforgiving world of the Ottoman peasant, that's the absolute best review breakfast was ever going to get. The first battle of the day is over. You've survived. Now for the rest of them. You've barely finished choking down the last of your hard, dense bread, the gritty texture still coating your tongue, when a new sound cuts through the quiet morning. It's not the wind, and it's not the bleating of a neighbor's sheep. It's the rhythmic, heavy tread of horses. Your heart gives a familiar, tired little jump of dread. You know who it is. Everyone knows. You haven't even had a chance to start your work for the day, and already the next ordeal has arrived. There's a sharp knock at the flimsy wooden door of your hut. It's not a neighbor stopping by to chat. It's not a friend coming to share a moment of peace. It's the Ottoman tax collector, the medieval world's version of a debt collector, only far, far scarier, because he comes with the full, unquestionable weight of the entire empire behind him. He doesn't arrive alone. That's not how this works. He arrives with a small entourage designed for maximum efficiency and intimidation. There's the collector himself, probably a man who has seen every excuse and heard every sob story, and is now completely immune to all of them. Beside him is a scribe, a man with a large, leather-bound book filled with names and numbers. Your name is in that book, and a pot of ink that seems to hold your fate. And flanking them are a couple of guards, soldiers with hard faces and sharp, curved swords hanging at their hips, a very clear and silent form of encouragement. The whole group carries with them an air of absolute authority, an expression that says, plain as day, we will absolutely take your chickens. In this empire, taxes are like the weather, they are completely unavoidable, and they are very rarely pleasant. You pay for everything. You pay a tax on the small patch of land you work. You pay a tax on the crops you manage to grow on that land. You pay a tax on the few animals you own. As a peasant, you owe about a tenth of everything you produce directly to the local Tamariot, a cavalryman who was granted your land by the Sultan in exchange for military service. On top of that, you owe a small rent in cash for the privilege of farming land that ultimately belongs to the Sultan, and you are required to work for free on the Timariot's own personal estate for a set number of days each year. You stand before them, your head bowed, and hand over a sack of grain, the product of months of back-breaking labor. You've prayed it will be enough. It isn't. It's never enough. The scribe finds your name in his big book, dips his pen, and makes a note, muttering something under his breath about arrears, about what you still owe. One of the guards lets his eyes wander over to your worn-out boots, and you can see him thinking they'd probably fit him a lot better. You try to argue, to plead. It's a fool's errand, but you have to try. You say, but the harvest was bad this year. The rains didn't come. The collector just stares at you with dead eyes and says, "Not my problem." Desperate, you try again, your voice cracking. "My children are starving." He doesn't even blink. Then they'll eat less. Finally, your shoulders slump in defeat. "I have nothing left." A small, cruel smile plays on the collector's lips. He points a finger at the goat your family depends on. "I'll take that." Your heart sinks. That goat was the only reason you had milk for your children. Now you have nothing but a deep, burning grudge and a future of lactose deficiency. And if you're really, truly unlucky, the collector might decide you're lying, that you're hiding something from him. That's when the beatings start. Ottoman tax law had a wonderfully efficient system of encouragement. You hit the peasant until the money magically appears. Spoiler alert, the money doesn't appear, but the bruises certainly do. Now, if you happen to be a Christian or a Jew living in the empire, you get to experience a whole special layer of this financial joy. After you've paid all the regular taxes on your land and your grain and your animals, the collector looks at you and presents you with an extra bill. This one is called the jizya. It was a special head tax that was only levied on non-Muslim male subjects. The official, polite label for this tax was that it was a payment for protection. Protection from what, you might ask? The answer is as simple as it is terrifying protection from the empire itself, of course. It was the medieval version of a mafia shakedown. Nice little village you've got here. It would be a shame if someone came and confiscated it. The official logic was that since non-Muslims were exempt from being drafted into the Sultan's army, the jizya was their contribution to the state in place of military service. In its own cold way, it was a brilliant piece of statecraft. The tax brought in a massive amount of revenue for the treasury, while at the same time constantly reinforcing the social hierarchy that placed Muslims at the very top. The process of collecting the jizya was a yearly public performance of this hierarchy. You would have to line up at the collector's table with all your fellow villagers. The Muslims in your community would shuffle past, grumbling about their own heavy taxes, but when your turn came, you had to pay the extra fee. This system wasn't just a crude shakedown, though it was often surprisingly bureaucratic. At certain times in the empire's history, a tiered system was put in place based on wealth. The richest non-Muslims paid the highest rate, the middle class paid a medium rate, and the poor paid the lowest possible rate. There were also many exemptions. Women, children, the elderly, the physically handicapped, the unemployed, and religious figures like priests and rabbis were not required to pay. However, the act of payment itself could be designed to be humiliating. While it wasn't a universal practice, the spirit of earlier Islamic jurisprudence sometimes lingered. One 12th century Syrian jurist, for example, had written that the tax collector should actually slap the non-Muslim on the back of the neck as he pays, to serve as a physical reminder of his subordinate status. While your local tax collector might not go that far, the message was still crystal clear. You were tolerated, you were protected, but you were not an equal. Your very existence was part of a contract, and the jizya was your signature, paid in coin and humility, year after year. The Ottoman system of so-called toleration was at its very core deeply pragmatic. Non-Muslim communities were allowed to exist, to practice their religions, and even to manage many of their own affairs, not because the sultans were modern multiculturalists, but because these communities were a valuable, manageable, and highly profitable part of the imperial machine. The tax system was simply the primary tool through which this managed, subordinate existence was enforced. By the time the tax collector and his entourage finally ride away, you are left broke, barefoot, and hungry all over again. You look at your family, try to force a weak smile, and think to yourself, well, at least they didn't take the roof. But the day has barely begun, and the empire has already taken almost everything you have. Just as you're contemplating the sheer bleakness of your morning meal and the visit from the tax collector, a different kind of dread begins to settle over your village. It's a quiet, creeping fear, passed in hushed whispers between neighbors and worried glances from mothers to their sons. This fear runs much deeper than the familiar pains of hunger or poverty. It's a primal, soul-deep terror that is reserved specifically for the Christian subjects of the empire, a spectre that haunts every family, particularly here in the rugged hills of the Balkans. It's the Day of the Dev. The official term simply means the collection, a sterile, bureaucratic word for a process that was anything but. To the people who lived through it, it was known by another, more honest name, the blood tax. It was the day the Sultan came not for your grain or your goats, but for your children. Imagine the scene. It starts with the sound of horses, but this isn't the familiar, plodding sound of the tax collector. This is the sound of a larger group, moving with military purpose. A company of stern-faced Ottoman officials rides into your village square, their armor and weapons gleaming, their expressions hard and unreadable. An unnerving silence falls over the village. Doors are shut. People watch from behind cracked shutters. The officials dismount, their authority absolute. Their first demand is not for money, but for the local priest. They command him to bring out the church's most sacred documents, the baptismal records. These records, which mark the entry of each child into the Christian faith, are now to be used as a roster for recruitment into an Islamic army. Then the order is given. All the boys in the village, usually between the tender ages of 8 and 18, are to be brought to the square and lined up. Their families are forced to watch in a state of silent, helpless terror as the officials walk slowly down the line, inspecting each boy with the detached, appraising eye of a farmer buying livestock. They are looking for the best, the strongest, the healthiest, the ones with a spark of intelligence in their eyes. Then it happens. An official, without a word, raises his hand and points a single, decisive finger at a boy. Maybe it's your son. Maybe it's your neighbor's son, a boy you've watched grow up. We'll take that one. And just like that, it's over. There are no negotiations. There are no heartfelt appeals. There is no bargaining. Tears and pleas mean nothing here. That boy is no longer a son, a brother, or a friend. He is now, in the eyes of the state, the property of the Sultan. He is separated from his family and herded together with the other chosen boys. He is marched away from his home, from the only fields and streams he has ever known, from his entire world, very likely never to be seen or heard from again. The finality of it is absolute, a clean and brutal amputation of a child from his family, a trauma that would leave a gaping wound that would haunt his parents for the rest of their lives. For the boy, this terrifying moment is the beginning of a long, systematic process, a journey designed with chilling precision to erase his past and forge him, piece by piece, into a new man. The boy's journey to becoming a servant of the Sultan doesn't start in a harsh military barracks, as you might expect. The system was far more subtle, more psychologically astute than that. His first stop is in the home of a Turkish family, deep in the heartland of Anatolia. Here, he is forced to forget the language his mother spoke to him, the lullabies she sang. He is completely immersed in a new world, where he must learn to speak, think, and even dream in Turkish. He is stripped of his Christian faith, the religion of his ancestors, and is forcibly converted to Islam, a process sealed with the ritual of circumcision. This isn't just a simple education or a change of scenery. It is a complete and total psychological and cultural reprogramming, a systematic dismantling of his identity, designed with one purpose in mind: to sever every single tie he has to his old life, to his family, and to his people. His memories are rendered useless, his loyalties are wiped clean, leaving a blank slate upon which the state can write a new identity. After a few years of this cultural immersion, once his old life is a distant, foggy memory, he is sent to an Asimi Lan, or a cadet school. Life here is monastic and brutal, a world of iron-willed discipline and constant, grueling hard labor. He is taught, through endless drills and harsh punishments, to view the military corps as his only family, and the distant, godlike Sultan as his one and only father. His loyalty is not something that is requested of him, it is engineered, built into the very fibre of his being through years of indoctrination. But for the most exceptional of these boys, the brightest, the most talented, the ones who truly stood out, an even more exclusive and extraordinary path awaited them. They were chosen for the Enderun School, located within the hallowed walls of the Topkap Palace itself. You can think of this as the Harvard of the Ottoman Empire, what some historians have called the world's first institutionalized education program specifically for the gifted. The curriculum at the Enderun was astonishingly comprehensive, designed to produce the perfect Ottoman servant. Students learned Islamic sciences, which included achieving fluency in the three great languages of the empire, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. They studied what were called positive sciences, which included advanced mathematics, astronomy, and geography. They were drilled relentlessly in history, law, and the incredibly complex administration of the sprawling empire. But it didn't stop there. They also received vocational training in fine arts and music, and of course, they underwent extensive physical conditioning and weapons training. The ultimate goal was to produce a true polymath, a man who was equally comfortable commanding a vast army on the plains of Hungary, composing a delicate poem in Persian, or managing the complex finances of an entire province. The cruel genius of the Dev system was now fully revealed. It wasn't just a way to get soldiers, it was a machine for creating the empire's future elite, a system that took the sons of conquered Christian peasants and transformed them into the Sultan's most loyal and capable administrators, viziers, and generals, ensuring that the levers of power were held by men who had no family, no land, and no loyalty to anyone or anything but the state that had made them. While the most gifted of the collected boys were sent to the palace schools to become the empire's future leaders, the vast majority were destined for a different, though no less extraordinary, path. They were to become janissaries, the most feared and respected soldiers of their age. The official word for them was kap-kolar, which translates to slaves of the port, with the porter being another name for the Ottoman court and the Sultan's government. Now, the word slave probably brings a very specific, grim image to mind. But you need to understand, this was a status unlike any other form of slavery that existed anywhere in the world. These men might have been the Sultan's property, but they were his most prized, most powerful, and most privileged property. Far from living in chains, the janissaries were paid a regular, handsome salary. They received generous bonuses after successful campaigns or when a new sultan took the throne, and they were granted a pension upon their retirement. They formed their own powerful, elite social class, a brotherhood so influential that it often rivaled and even surpassed the old Turkish aristocracy in wealth and political clout. Their entire identity was forged from the moment they entered the cadet schools, reforged in a culture of intense, almost fanatical brotherhood. Everything about them was designed to set them apart from the rest of society. They wore unique, distinctive uniforms that made them instantly recognizable, and on their heads, they wore an iconic white felt hat called a barake, and tucked neatly into a small holder on the front of that hat was a simple, yet incredibly powerful symbol, a spoon. This wasn't just for eating, this was the symbol of the Kayak Card Alii, which means the Brotherhood of the Spoon. It was a constant, visible reminder that they all ate from the same pot, that they shared the same food, fought together as one, and would die together as one. Their loyalty was not to a piece of land or a distant family they could no longer remember. It was to the man standing next to them in the battle line. For centuries, the rules that governed their lives were incredibly strict. They were forbidden to marry. They were forbidden to engage in trade or own a business. These measures were put in place for a very specific reason, to ensure their complete, total, and undivided loyalty was directed at one man and one man only, the Sultan. But here, right here, lies the great, tragic, and bloody paradox of the Janissary system. This perfect tool of loyalty, this army of men engineered to have no family, But the Sultan, eventually, over time, became the single most powerful and dangerous political force in the entire empire. Their absolute loyalty, once directed squarely at the person sitting on the throne, slowly and surely began to shift. It shifted away from the man and towards the institution. It shifted to their own corporate interests, to the preservation of their own power and privilege. The very institution that had been so brilliantly designed to protect the Sultan became the one thing that could, and often did, break him. If the Janissaries were displeased with a new policy, if a payment of their salary was even slightly late, they had a famous and terrifying way of showing their anger. They would march as one to the great square in front of the palace. And there, in a deafening, symbolic act of defiance, they would overturn their giant soup cauldrons, the very source of their brotherhood of the spoon. When those cauldrons crashed onto the cobblestones, everyone in the palace, from the lowest servant to the Sultan himself, knew what it meant. It was a signal of mutiny, a threat of open rebellion that could end with the palace gates being stormed and the Sultan being dragged from his throne. Over the centuries, they became a deeply reactionary force within the empire. They fiercely resisted any and all military reforms, especially those that threatened their unique and privileged status as the top fighting force. The watchdogs of the empire had slowly, but surely, become its bullies, a powerful and entitled mob capable of deposing and even murdering any sultan who dared to cross them. You see, the Ottoman state, in a stroke of what at first seemed like administrative genius, had solved the age-old problem that plagued every other kingdom, the problem of feudal rebellion, of powerful nobles with their own lands, their own wealth, and their own loyalties, who could challenge the king. By creating an elite class of soldiers and administrators who were completely detached from the general population, men who had no family, no land, and no regional ties to distract them, they engineered a force whose loyalty was, in theory, supposed to be absolute. And for a long time, it worked brilliantly. But in doing so, they had inadvertently created a new and far more dangerous kind of monster. This new class, the Janissaries, had no stake in the broader society they were supposed to be protecting. Their family was the corpse. Their nation was the barracks. So, when the interests of the empire as a whole, such as the desperate need for military modernization to keep up with European powers, clashed with the interests of the Janissary corps, such as preserving their traditional power, their outdated weapons, and their high pay, they chose the corpse. Every single time. The very rootlessness that was meant to guarantee their unwavering loyalty to the state eventually meant that their only real loyalty was to themselves. The brilliant solution to one form of instability had sown the seeds of another, more insidious and more dangerous one, right at the very heart of the palace. The Sultan was now a prisoner of his own guards, his power dependent on keeping this volatile, dangerous brotherhood happy, and the empire would pay a heavy price for this paradox for centuries to come. It's just after midday, and a strange energy is moving through the crowded, chaotic streets of the bazaar. Word spreads like a ripple in a pond, passed from the spice merchant to the rug seller, from the water carrier to the baker. It travels not as a shout, but as a murmur, a collective whisper that seems to change the very air you breathe. The Sultan sneezed. You hear it, and at first, you might laugh to yourself. A sneeze. Who cares? But then you notice that no one else is laughing. The haggling has softened, the usual boisterous energy has faded. Men are looking at each other with a new tension in their eyes. They're sweating, because in the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's mood was the daily weather forecast, and a simple sneeze could mean a storm was on the horizon. You don't just live in the Ottoman Empire, you live under the rule of an absolute monarch, which is a very impressive sounding title until you stop and think about what the word absolute really means for you. It means that your life, your property, and your entire future belong, in a very real and legal sense, to him. The Sultan owns the land you farm. He owns the soldiers who march through your streets, and in effect, he owns you. You don't wake up in the morning and think, what do I want to do today? You wake up and think, how do I avoid dying today? The entire empire, this vast and sprawling political entity, runs on the whims of one single man, and those whims can be terrifyingly, dizzyingly arbitrary. This creates a world of constant, low-level panic, a state of permanent uncertainty where your fate can be decided by something as trivial as the Sultan's digestion. One day, he might be in a generous mood. If he likes you, if a poem you wrote pleases him, or the horse you sold him wins a race, you could be showered with unimaginable gifts. Titles, lands, a chest full of gold, a brand new robe of the finest silk. Your life could be transformed in an instant, your family elevated to a status you never dreamed possible. But that same arbitrary power cuts both ways. If the Sultan doesn't like you, if you bring him bad news, if he thinks you looked at him the wrong way, or if he's simply in a foul mood, your life is over. And the end, when it comes for the high-ranking officials of the court, is a uniquely Ottoman affair. There would be no messy, public beheadings. In the Ottoman court, shedding royal or noble blood was considered a messy, almost vulgar taboo. They preferred neatness, they preferred a quiet, dignified, and utterly terrifying efficiency. This was the infamous Ottoman touch. Imagine you are a powerful vizier, second only to the Sultan himself. You're sitting in your lavish home, sipping a cup of strong, sweet coffee, contemplating your immense wealth and influence. There's a polite knock at your door. 2 men enter. They are the palace guards, the silent, muscular men who are sworn to protect the Sultan. They smile warmly, carrying what looks like a beautiful silk scarf or a bowstring. For a moment, you might think it's a gift. How thoughtful. And then you realize, with a cold, final dread, that it's for you. They don't shout accusations, they don't draw swords, they just politely and with great strength slip the silk cord around your neck, and then poof. No more you. No blood, no mess, just a quiet, tidy removal. Like taking out the trash. This was the reality for anyone who flew too close to the sun in the Ottoman court. The richer your clothes, the shorter your leash. You learn to sleep very, very lightly, because silk bowstrings were made for much more than just tying packages. And don't make the mistake of thinking that only the ministers and nobles in Istanbul had to worry about the Sultan's mood swings. Everyone did. The ripples of his whims spread out from the palace and washed over every corner of the empire, affecting the lives of millions. Did the Sultan suddenly decide that his current palace was no longer grand enough, that he needed a new summer villa by the sea? That's wonderful for him. For you, the peasant hundreds of miles away, it means your labor has just been drafted. Soldiers will arrive in your village, and you'll be forced to leave your fields and your family, marching for weeks to a construction site where you'll spend the next year hauling stones and mixing mortar for a building you will never be allowed to enter. Did the Sultan take an insult from a foreign ambassador and decide to order a new war? Congratulations. Your son, the one who helps you plough the fields, is now marching off to the cold, distant lands of Hungary. He's given a pair of mouldy, ill-fitting boots, a rusty spear, and very little chance of ever returning. Your family's future has just been sacrificed for the sake of the Sultan's pride. For you, the ordinary subject, this means living in a state of constant, gnawing anxiety. You never know what the next day will bring. Maybe today the Sultan sneezes and decides to order a grand public festival with free food for everyone. Or maybe he sneezes and orders a new tax to pay for a new war. Or maybe, just maybe, he sneezes and decides to have half of his viziers strangled just to clear his sinuses. You don't know, and that's the entire point. In the Ottoman Empire, survival wasn't about being a good person, or working hard, or being smart. It was about being lucky. It was about the kind of pure, dumb luck where you find yourself on your knees at night, praying not for rain or a good harvest, but simply that the Sultan's lunch agrees with him. Because you know deep down in your bones that one upset stomach in the palace could very easily lead to a very upset empire for everyone else. The paranoia that saturated the air of the Ottoman court, the kind that could turn a sneeze into a state crisis, didn't just appear out of nowhere. It wasn't just the random whim of unstable men. It was a feature, not a bug of the system. It was a deep, gnawing fear that had baked into the very foundations of the dynasty. So you have to ask, what could possibly make a man who holds absolute power, a man who is the master of millions, live in such constant, suffocating fear? The answer, as is so often the case, was found not on the distant battlefields, but right there inside the palace walls. The biggest, most immediate, and most dangerous threat to a reigning sultan was, more often than not, his own family, his own flesh and blood, his brothers. In many European monarchies, the problem of succession was eventually solved, or at least managed by a simple rule: primogeniture. The eldest son inherits everything. It might not be fair, but it was clear. The Ottomans, however, didn't have such a rigid system. In their tradition, any son of the sultan was considered a legitimate heir to the throne. This created a brutal, zero-sum game. When the old sultan died, it wasn't a peaceful transition. It was a desperate, bloody race to the throne. All the sons would rush to the capital, and whichever one got there first and secured the loyalty of viziers and the janissaries would be the new sultan. The losers didn't just go back to their provincial estates. The losers, and all of their children, were usually executed to prevent them from becoming the face of a future rebellion. This inevitably led to devastating civil wars that could tear the empire apart for years, draining the treasury and costing thousands of lives. This wasn't some distant, theoretical threat. Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, the legendary figure who captured Constantinople, had seen this horror firsthand. His own grandfather had been forced to fight a long and brutal civil war against his own brothers to secure his rule, a conflict that had nearly destroyed the state. Mehmed, being a man of immense ambition and cold, hard pragmatism, decided to solve this problem once and for all. He looked at the chaos of civil war, the burned villages, the slaughtered armies, the fractured state, and compared it to the alternative. His solution was a form of preventative murder, codified into the official law of the land. In his great legal code, the Canoname, he laid it out in language is as clear as it is chilling, he wrote. And to whomever of my sons the sultanate shall be granted, it is proper for him to kill his brothers for the sake of the order of the world. Most of the Islamic scholars have approved this. Let them act on it. Let that sink in for a moment. This wasn't a secret, shameful act done in the shadows. This was the law. It was presented not as an act of personal cruelty, but as a grim, solemn duty, a terrible sacrifice made for the greater good, for Nizamem, Alem, the order of the world. The logic was as brutal as it was simple. The death of a few princes in a single, quiet night was a far smaller price to pay than the deaths of tens of thousands in a decade-long civil war. Imagine what this meant in practice. Imagine the day the old sultan dies. A new sultan, one of the many sons, ascends to the throne. His very first act as the ruler of this vast empire, before he can even think about policy or warfare, is to sign the death warrants for his own siblings. A team of silent executioners, often the palace guards themselves, would be dispatched. They would move through the palace, from one prince's apartment to the next, carrying with them the silk bowstring reserved for royalty. They would find the other brothers, some of them grown men, some of them just children, and carry out the law. It was a silent, bloodless, and brutally efficient purge, and the scale could be staggering. Some sultans, upon taking the throne, killed dozens of their own siblings and male relatives in a single day, just to keep things tidy. The entire male line of the previous generation, save for the one new ruler, would be wiped out in a matter of hours. Now, try to imagine what it was like to grow up as a prince in this world. Think about your own childhood sibling rivalries, fights over a toy, an argument over who gets the bigger piece of cake. Now, imagine that same rivalry, but with the highest possible stakes. Imagine growing up in the gilded cage of the Topkap Palace, knowing from the moment you could understand that the brother you play with in the gardens, the one you learn to ride horses with, the one you share your secrets with, is also your most likely murderer. Every interaction would be poisoned by this knowledge. A kind word could be a manipulation. A shared laugh could hide a deadly ambition. Every success you had, being a better horseman, a smarter student, more popular with the soldiers, didn't just earn you praise, it marked you as a bigger threat, moving you higher up the execution list for when the time came. It was a childhood lived under a permanent death sentence, where the only variable was whether you would be the one giving the order or the one receiving the silk bowstring. You might have thought your own sibling rivalry was rough. Try the Ottoman version, where the winner gets the entire empire, all of Constantinople and its riches, and the loser gets a quiet, shallow grave, often without so much as a marker to say they ever existed. This law, designed to create stability, instead created a dynasty steeped in paranoia and blood, ensuring that every new ruler began his reign with the murder of his own family. A system built on such institutionalized paranoia, a dynasty that legally required a new ruler to murder his own brothers, was bound to produce some interesting rulers. And in the long, bloody history of the Ottoman Empire, none were more interesting or more terrifyingly broken than the man known as Sultan Ibrahim, who reigned, or rather, staggered through his reign from 1640 to 1648. His story is a perfect, tragic case study in how the empire's brutal solutions often created far worse problems. To understand Ibrahim, you have to go back to his youth. A youth he spent locked away from the world in a place called the Cafes, which literally means the cage. Now, this wasn't some dark stone dungeon with chains on the wall. The cage was a lavishly decorated set of rooms, a suite within the sprawling Topkapi palace, where potential heirs to the throne were kept under constant, watchful guard. It was a gilded prison, but a prison nonetheless. And for Ibrahim, it was a place of unending psychological torture. He lived there day in and day out in a state of constant, paralyzing terror. From the gilded bars of his window, he had watched as his older brother, the fierce and ruthless Sultan Murad IV, had systematically executed 3 of their other brothers. Imagine that. Imagine spending your adolescence knowing that the man on the throne, your own brother, could at any moment send his silent executioners to your door. This terror reached its absolute peak the day Sultan Murad IV died. The Grand Vizier, the most powerful man in the empire after the Sultan, walked with his entourage to the doors of the cage to inform Ibrahim that his terrifying brother was dead, and that he, Ibrahim, was now the new Sultan. This should have been a moment of incredible relief, of liberation. For Ibrahim, it was the most terrifying moment of his life. He was so convinced that this was an elaborate trap, a final, cruel trick by his brother to lure him out to his death, that he refused to open the door. He barricaded himself inside, screaming that he would not come out. The situation grew desperate. Finally, his mother, the powerful and influential Khaosem Sultan, was summoned. Even her pleas couldn't convince him. So, in a final, gruesome act of persuasion, she gave the order. Sultan Murad's corpse was brought from his deathbed and dragged through the palace corridors to the door of the cage. Only when Ibrahim looked through the peephole and saw the cold, lifeless body of the brother he had feared his entire life did he finally, cautiously, accept that it wasn't a trick. He was finally free. He was finally the Sultan. But the cage had already done its work. The man who emerged from that gilded prison was not a ruler. He was a shattered wreck of a human being. Unsurprisingly, years of living in a state of absolute terror and complete isolation had left him profoundly and permanently psychologically damaged. As Sultan, his behavior was not just eccentric, it was dangerously erratic and wildly impulsive. He quickly developed a series of bizarre and all-consuming obsessions. He had a strange passion for enormously overweight women. It wasn't just a preference, it was state policy. He sent his agents on missions across the entire empire with the sole task of finding the fattest women possible and bringing them back to his harem. He also developed an obsession with furs, an obsession so extreme that it became the stuff of legend. He had an entire room in the palace lined, from floor to ceiling, with the most expensive lynx and sable pelts he could find. The floors, the walls, the ceiling, everything was covered in soft, luxurious fur. This particular fixation earned him a nickname from European observers, Le Fou de Fourrures, the madman of furs. But his whims were not just quirky, they were deadly. His moods could swing in an instant from giddy indulgence to murderous rage. In one infamous story, which may be an exaggeration but speaks to his terrifying reputation, he is said to have become convinced that one of his concubines had been unfaithful. Unable to find the supposed culprit, he ordered that all 280 women of his harem be tied up in weighted sacks and drowned in the cold, swirling waters of the Bosphorus Strait. A more verifiable and perhaps even more chilling incident shows just how broken he truly was. Ibrahim became completely infatuated with the infant son of one of his slave women. He doted on this child, preferring him to his own son and heir, the young Prince Mehmed IV. When Mehmed's mother, the boy's own mother, understandably complained about this, Ibrahim flew into a volcanic rage. He snatched his own son from her arms, and without a moment's hesitation, threw the small child into a palace pool to drown. The little boy was saved at the last second by a quick-thinking servant, but not before he had hit the bottom, leaving him with a deep, permanent scar on his forehead for the rest of his life. Eventually, his boundless corruption and terrifying madness became too much for even the Ottoman system to bear. The empire was being run into the ground by his insane whims and extravagant spending. In 1648, the Janissaries, the ultimate arbiters of a sultan's fate, had finally had enough. They revolted. Ibrahim was captured, deposed, and thrown back into the cage he so desperately feared. A few days later, with the reluctant, heartbreaking consent of his own mother, Kosem Sultan, who realized he was a threat to the entire dynasty, the executioners were sent to his door one last time. The man who had spent his entire life fearing the silk bowstring finally met his end, strangled by his own guards. The story of Sultan Ibrahim is the ultimate proof of how the empire's systems of control could backfire in the most spectacular way. The law of fratricide was so brutal that it was replaced by the cage. But the cage, the supposed humane solution, created rulers who were either completely inexperienced political novices, or in Ibrahim's case, deeply traumatized individuals utterly unfit to rule. The solution to the problem of succession had become far worse than the problem itself, creating a cycle of paranoia and violence that ultimately weakened the empire from within. Alright, so we've walked through the brutal world of sultans and their paranoid politics, a world where your own brother is your deadliest rival. Now let's step through another door, into the most famous and most misunderstood part of the palace, the imperial harem. You've heard the rumors, I'm sure. You've seen the paintings. The very word harem conjures up a specific fantasy, a perfumed paradise of silk cushions, bubbling fountains, and hundreds of beautiful, exotic women lounging around in luxurious boredom, waiting to be fed grapes by a servant. It's an image of pure, decadent fantasy, and you need to forget it. Right now, that version of the harem is a complete work of fiction, a fantasy painted by 19th century European artists who had never, ever set foot inside its walls. The reality was far more complex, far more structured, and in many ways, far more brutal. So, let's imagine you are a woman who ends up in the Ottoman harem. The first thing to understand is that you weren't invited here for a party. You were brought. Maybe you were a young girl captured during a war in the Caucasus, torn from your home and family. Maybe you were sold into slavery by your own impoverished parents, who saw it as the only way to ensure you'd be fed. Or maybe you were presented to the Sultan as a gift from a provincial governor, delivered to the palace like some kind of bizarre, exotic fruit basket. However you got here, your status is now undeniable. You are a slave. Yes, you are immediately stripped of your old, rough clothes and dressed in the finest silks and adorned with delicate jewelry. But don't be fooled. Those beautiful clothes are not a gift, they are a prison uniform. The harem is not a fantasy of freedom and pleasure. It is a gilded cage, and it just happens to have much, much better curtains. This gilded cage was not a place of lazy, unstructured leisure. It was run with the cold, hard precision of a military institution. Think of it as a parallel world to the male-only Enderun school we talked about earlier. It was a highly structured, fiercely competitive hierarchy where every single woman had a rank, a role, and a clear path for advancement or failure. At the very, very top of this pyramid was the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan. She was the undisputed, absolute ruler of the harem, the CEO with zero tolerance for nonsense, and often she was the most powerful woman in the entire empire, wielding immense influence over her son and, by extension, the affairs of state. Below her were the sultan's official consorts, known as Kadan. They were ranked by seniority, the head consort, the second consort, the third, and so on. A step below them were the Iqbal, which means the favorites. These were concubines who had successfully caught the sultan's eye and shared his bed, but hadn't yet achieved the security and status of a full consort. And at the very bottom of this ladder were the newcomers, the novices known as the Asimi. If you just arrived, this is where you would start. Your life would be one of constant, rigorous training. You would be taught music, how to play an instrument, how to sing. You'd learn to dance, to compose poetry, and you'd be drilled in the complex rules of palace etiquette. But your education went much further than that. You would also be taught about politics, about the intricate workings of the empire, and you might even learn multiple languages. The goal was to turn you into a beautiful, graceful, and intelligent companion, a woman worthy of potentially spending a night with the master of the world. Your entire life, from the moment you woke to the moment you slept, was a constant, ruthless, all-consuming competition for one single thing, the Sultan's attention. Everything in this world revolved around him. If he happened to notice you, if he chose you to spend a single night with him, your status would skyrocket overnight. You would move from the crowded dormitories of the novices to a more private room. You would receive better clothes, better food, and a higher stipend. You would go from being a nobody to a somebody in the blink of an eye, and if that one night led to a pregnancy, and you managed to bear the Sultan a son, you had just hit the jackpot. You were now the mother of a potential future Sultan, a position that came with immense prestige and power. But what if he never looked your way? What if, out of the hundreds of women in the harem, your face just never caught his eye? Then you were just another face in a very crowded room, destined to live out your days in quiet obscurity. You would eventually be pensioned off, or perhaps married to some minor official in a distant province, your dreams of glory fading into a quiet, unremarkable life. This high-stakes environment created a world of brutal, backstabbing politics. Every woman in the harem was constantly scheming, whispering in corridors, forming strategic alliances with other women, and trying to gain the favor of the powerful eunuchs who guarded the harem and controlled all access to the sultan. Favors were bought and sold. Secrets were weaponized, and sometimes the skimming took a much darker turn. It was not unheard of for a woman to try and slip questionable herbs, or even outright poison, into a rival's food to remove her from the competition permanently. The stakes were incredibly high, because one wrong move, one careless word spoken to the wrong person, and you didn't just lose the Sultan's favor. You might very well lose your life. Concubines who fell from grace, who displeased the Sultan or the Valide Sultan, could find themselves poisoned by an unknown hand, strangled in their sleep, or, perhaps most terrifyingly of all, they could be disappeared, vanishing from the harem without a trace, never to be spoken of again. This was the reality of the harem. It wasn't a paradise. It was a beautiful, glittering snake pit, where the game of seduction was really a game of survival. But for a woman with a rare combination of fierce intelligence, ruthless ambition, and a little bit of luck, the harem wasn't just a prison, it was the ultimate career ladder. It was a place where, if you played the deadly game just right, you could climb from the absolute bottom of society to the very pinnacle of power, and in the long and storied history of the Ottoman Empire, no one climbed that ladder better, faster, or with more history-altering consequences than a young woman who was known to the Western world as Roxolana, and to the Ottomans, with a mixture of awe and fear, as Hurrem Sultan. Her story is the stuff of absolute legends, a journey so improbable it feels like a fairy tale, albeit a dark and bloody one. Her life began thousands of miles away from the gilded halls of Istanbul. She is believed to have been born in what is now modern-day Ukraine. The daughter of an Orthodox priest, her life was unremarkable until the day her village was attacked by slave raiders. She was captured, torn from her family, and forced on a long, brutal journey that ended in the chaotic, sprawling slave market of Istanbul. There, amidst the desperation and the degradation, this young, red-haired girl was purchased and eventually presented as a gift to the young man who was destined to become the empire's greatest and most famous ruler, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. When she arrived at the palace, she was just one of hundreds of young women, a nameless, faceless concubine with no status and no future. The deck was completely stacked against her. Suleiman already had a chief consort, a woman named Mahidevran, who had already done the one thing that mattered most. She had borne him a son, the heir to the throne. But this new girl, Hurrem, whose name fittingly means the joyful one, quickly and completely captured the Sultan's heart. She wasn't just beautiful, she was different. She was incredibly clever, witty, and possessed a political mind that was sharper than any dagger in the palace. An early incident in her career reveals the sheer brilliance of her political savvy. The chief consort, Mahidevran, was furious at this new rival who was stealing the Sultan's attention. In a fit of jealous rage, she physically attacked Hurrem, scratching her face, pulling her hair, and leaving her bruised and disheveled. Later that same night, when a messenger arrived to inform Hurrem that the Sultan had summoned her to his chambers, she did something incredibly risky and incredibly smart. She refused to go. She sent a message back to the Sultan, saying that she was too disfigured and too unworthy to appear before him in her current state. This, of course, only made Suleiman more intrigued. He insisted. When Hurrem was finally brought before him, her face still bearing the fresh scratches from Mahidevran's attack, Suleiman's intrigue turned to cold fury. His anger at his chief consort for this vicious attack was so great that it effectively ended Mahidevran's reign as his favourite on the spot, and in that same moment, it solidified Hurrem's position as the new, undisputed favourite in his heart. It was a masterclass in turning a moment of victimization into a moment of ultimate triumph. From that moment on, Hurrem began to systematically shatter every single tradition that had governed the harem for centuries. The first and most important rule she broke was the unspoken policy of all one concubine, one son. This practice was designed to prevent any single woman from gaining too much influence by having multiple sons, all potential heirs to the throne. Hurrem didn't just ignore this rule, she obliterated it. She bore Suleiman not one son, but 5 sons, as well as a daughter, ensuring that her own bloodline would dominate the future of the dynasty. Then, after years of consolidating her power, came the most shocking, most revolutionary move of all. In the year 1533, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent did something that no Ottoman sultan had ever done before in the entire history of the empire. He formally and legally freed Hurrem from her status as a slave. And then, in an even more stunning break with tradition, he legally married her, making this former slave girl his lawfully wedded wife, Hurrem Sultan, the Empress of the Ottoman Empire. The news sent shockwaves through the court and across Europe. A Genoese ambassador, writing home in a state of utter disbelief, called it most extraordinary event, one absolutely unprecedented in the history of the sultans. Her power, now formalized and absolute, became immense. She convinced Suleiman to let her move out of the old harem, the traditional home of the sultan's concubines, and into a new, lavish suite of apartments built for her right next to his own in the main Topkapi palace. Another shocking break with tradition. This move was not just about comfort. It was a physical representation of her new status, placing her literally at the center of political power. When Suleiman was away on his long and frequent military campaigns, Rem became his most trusted advisor and political correspondent. She would read state reports, write him letters detailing the goings-on in the capital, and offer him her shrewd political advice. She also became a massive public figure in her own right, commissioning mosques, soup kitchens for the poor, and beautiful public baths across the empire, projects that made her a beloved and respected figure among the common people. Her rise was so complete, and her influence so profound, that she is now seen by historians as the figure who single-handedly kicked off the era known as the Sultanate of Women, a period of over a century where the women of the imperial harem, particularly the mothers of the sultans, wielded enormous and direct political power. Harem's incredible story reveals the true nature of the harem. It was not a sideshow to the real business of the empire, it was the main event. Because all power flowed directly from the person of the sultan, physical proximity to him was the ultimate political currency. And there was no place of greater proximity than the harem. The so-called private life of the sultan was, in fact, the most public and high-stakes political game in the entire empire. A rivalry between two concubines wasn't just personal drama, it was a battle to see whose son would one day inherit the throne. A struggle that would determine the course of the empire for an entire generation. The harem was a shadow state, operating with its own rules and its own currency of favor and influence, and its politics were, quite literally, a matter of life and death. The sun rises again, a sliver of pale light cutting through the cracks in your mud wall, though you could swear you never actually slept. Your body aches from the lumpy straw mat that served as your bed. Your stomach immediately resumes its low, growling protest, a hollow reminder that a piece of hard bread isn't really food, and your nerves are completely fried, shredded by the endless, pounding rhythm of the war drums that echoed through the night, a constant, threatening heartbeat of the empire. Congratulations. You have officially, somehow, survived one full day in the Ottoman Empire. But here's the cruel joke: you haven't really survived at all, because now the entire miserable cycle cranks back into motion and starts all over again. The game doesn't end, it just resets. So what's the plan for today? What new path will you choose? You look around your tiny, smoke-filled world and consider your options, and a wave of hopelessness washes over you as you realize you have none. You could try to continue as a farmer, the so-called safe job. But you now know what that means. It's just legalized starvation dressed up as honest labor. You break your back in the fields from sunup to sundown, working land that isn't yours, only to have the tax collector show up at any minute, demanding the single chicken you don't even own. Maybe you think about speaking up, about gathering your neighbors and protesting the injustice of it all. But you quickly crush that thought. If you so much as mutter a complaint in the street, a neighbor, desperate for a small reward or terrified of being accused himself, might report you for treason. If you try to find a moment of comfort in a city coffee house, a place of warmth and conversation, you know it's a minefield. One wrong laugh at a joke about the Sultan, one careless word, could get you hauled away and accused of blasphemy. The walls really do have ears, and so does the man pouring your coffee. So farming is out, public life is out. What's left? Perhaps you dream of escaping the mud and joining the sophisticated, powerful bureaucracy. Don't. That path is even quicker to the grave. You might get a fancy robe and a taste of power, but you'll live in constant fear, knowing you're just one misplaced document, one wrong word written on the wrong piece of paper, away from a quiet visit from the men with the silk bowstring. Okay, so the pen is no safer than the plough. What about the sword? Maybe the army is the answer. But the army is even worse. It's a life of endless marches in rotten boots that fall apart after a week, leaving your feet as raw as boiled meat. It's a diet of stale, mouldy bread and a thin soup that tastes suspiciously like sock water. Your reward for all this suffering might be a heroic death on some forgotten battlefield in Hungary. That is, if the dysentery doesn't get you first. And what about the powers that be? Can you appeal to them? The Sultan, you'll never see him, and you'll certainly never know if his sneeze tomorrow means a public holiday or your public execution. And the harem, that's supposed paradise. That's not a dream you want to have. It's a nightmare with better wallpaper. And sleep, a basic human need. The one small escape you should have. Forget about it. Between the call to prayer echoing from the minarets before dawn, the endless pounding of the Janissary drums, the marching of soldiers in the street, the whispers and gossip of your nervous neighbours, and your own stomach making noises like a dying goat, rest is just another fantasy in a world that offers none. By now, as you stand in the dim light of your second morning, you've finally realised the fundamental, soul-crushing truth. The Ottoman Empire wasn't built for you. It wasn't designed for your comfort, your happiness, or your survival. It was built for the Sultan on his throne, for the army that protected his power, and for the vast bureaucracy that was designed to do one thing with ruthless efficiency: to squeeze you, the peasant, like a lemon, until there was absolutely nothing left to give. You are not a citizen of this great empire. You are not a cherished subject. You are a resource. A very, very tired, chronically underfed, and deeply paranoid resource. So when that weak morning light finally creeps through the cracks in your wall, and you drag your aching body up for another round of hard bread, crippling taxes and constant gnawing fear, deep down in your bones, that you wouldn't last another day. Honestly, you barely survived this one. And this is the ultimate truth of your existence here. Life in the Ottoman Empire, for the 90%, wasn't about living. It wasn't about thriving, or building, or dreaming. It was about avoiding death for just a little while longer, long enough to hand over your last goat before you collapsed. And the odds are you've already failed. So yes, the history books will always talk about the glorious palaces, the mighty armies, and the golden ages of art and literature. But you, the person whose story we've just followed, you won't be in those books. You're just the exhausted, forgotten peasant in the footnotes.